Welcome to Queer Art Podcast. This interview series documents the prodigious yet visually dissonant work of LGBTQIA plus artists. The series is moderated by New York City artist Christopher Stout and shares perspectives and life stories from trailblazing elders and rising voices. The goal of this podcast is to broaden our understanding of both the aesthetics and the people defining contemporary queer art. Thank you for listening. Welcome to episode 1 of Queer Art Podcast. Today we are honored to speak with artist Andrew Cornell Robinson. Welcome and thank you for being our launch interview. Let's kick off our discussion with some short answer icebreaker questions. So, in the addition to the title of artist, which letters from the LGBTQIA plus acronym would you like to claim?
Oh, I would say a G and a Q for sure.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
What are your preferred pronouns?
Oh, he, him.
Cool. For how many years have you been making visual art?
I mean, at least since like 1978. I got started really early. I grew up in a house that was filled with art and books. My mom was a painter and my dad was an actor and a writer. So art, music, all that stuff was kind of just assumed that we would do it, and was just part of the daily existence.
I love it. This means we're in capable hands.
Yeah.
Describe the physical aspects of your art in layman's terms. What
Oh,
type of
sure.
art do you make? What materials are used?
Okay. Well, I studied ceramics, so ceramics plays a pretty big role in a lot of what I do. Although I got my master's degree in painting. So, essentially I kind of vary between ceramic assemblage, kind of three-dimensional collage and painting. And I tend to lean more toward figurative than abstraction, although they kind of waver between the two. Lately, I'm doing a lot more things that deal with portraiture and also like the erasure of portraiture. So I might begin with a figure and then I'm layering and kind of building up surfaces in clay and also in paint. So like an example would be, let's say I begin with a ceramic kind of stoneware or porcelain kind of surface. And what I do is I'll layer slips and glazes. Slip is basically a colored clay. And then I'll also take my drawings that I've printed onto a very thin paper called Gampi paper. It's like a rice paper. And that has like a glaze or an underglaze. So it's a drawing. And what that does is it allows me to transfer the drawings from the paper onto my clay, almost like a little kid's tattoo, those little removable things.
Sure.
And so my images tend to be covered and layered with a lot of drawing and then scratched away. Sgraffito is the term that's typically used. So that's kind of where it ends up.
Awesome. So I know your work, you know your work. A lot of people may be here because they're ready to learn about your work and about queer art
Sure.
in general. So I'm going to
Mhm.
start with a warm-up exercise.
Okay.
What we're going to do is we're going to look at your work, give it just a title, just the year, not say anything about it, just let them look at it. Then I'm going to
Okay.
ask you a bunch of questions about yourself, and then we're going to go back and look at your work in armed with the information of who you are and your experience, and
Okay.
like let you do like a really rich deep dive into something.
Oh, goody.
So,
Let's play.
okay, perfect.
So this is called Confabulation Fantabulosa, number 4.
Yes.
Its subtitle is Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, which is a title that I took from a book of the same, title, which is kind of a memoir of a Scottish lesbian woman who grew up in a very religious household. And it's a great book if you don't know it. It's fabulous. One of the books that I read when I was coming out, and it had a huge impact on me as a
And it
young
was
man.
made in 2023, and
Yeah.
the materials are glazed porcelain with
Mhm.
underglaze silk screen print decal transfer. Can you say a
Yeah,
couple words about what that means?
sure. So, silk screen print decal transfers are the process that I was just describing, where I'm
Okay.
printing essentially an underglaze colorant onto rice paper. So the image that you see is essentially an image that I kind of processed through halftone. It's a still from a film about Caravaggio, and then I basically printed that directly onto the porcelain. And the image in the middle, the object in the middle is a fake orange, hence the title. So a lot of my work, this is like a really simple example of the kind of technique that I typically use in my work. It's
Great.
kind of cool.
Let's look at something else.
Sure.
So here's number two.
hmm So this one, Pentimento 3, Silence Do Good. This is a work that was done right before I started doing the Fantabulosa pieces. Pentimento is a painting term. It basically means an image that kind of emerges from overpainting. So, you might see an example. Let's say if you ever see like a building that comes down in a city or a town, and on the building that's next to it, you might see like the ghost image of an old early 20th or 19th century billboard that's painted. That's an example of a pentimento, kind of a ghost image, if you will. So
Oh,
this piece has ceramic and plastic, as well as this image that's printed onto paper and mounted typically to tin, is how I typically work. And I've often been wrestling with the juxtaposition of an image and an object, and I kind of resolved to just put them together.
awesome.
Uh, if you're wondering what Silence Dogood is, it's actually a pen name of Benjamin Franklin. He would write in these letters. This was like Silence Dogood was like a widow who was complaining about the British and talking about revolutionary ideas. And he used these kind of drag personas, believe it or not, in newspapers, and he would write kind of radical texts, and they were often quite funny too. He was an interesting character.
Um, this was also made, or sorry, it was made in 2023. Yeah, they both were made
Yeah.
in 2023.
Yeah.
The third one's a little bit earlier. I'll let you take it away with the title and the
Oh,
materials.
sure. So this is simply Pentimento 28. It's actually a combination of print transfers. So the blue imagery that you see of cactus and plants and things are essentially transferred directly onto a piece of porcelain. It's about the size of a swollen belly. So it's not super small, but it's smaller than a lot of my works. And then piece next to it is an image of a friend of mine, Zachary, that I took for a study for a large painting I was doing of him. And I kind of processed it through halftone and then printed it and mounted the paper to tin and then started crushing it, kind of thinking a little bit about John Chamberlain. But in essence, a lot of the work that I deal with is this kind of layering and obliteration. So the image becomes almost like a field, like an abstraction. And even the images themselves, when I'm crushing them and distorting them, all of it kind of has this theme of distortion, abstraction, and kind of erasure in a way. So everything becomes a little bit out of focus, which is interesting to me.
Wonderful. So this helps us wash away whatever we've been doing and connect into your work. And so with
Sure.
all of this in mind, I want to turn it back, focus on you, and ask you some questions about your life and your art.
Sure.
So you mentioned that you had a lot of deep experience with art growing up through connections with your family and your mother who was painting. When did
Mhm.
you first specifically realize that art was going to become your profession?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think profession. I didn't really even know that was an option. Um, I mean, in a way, I guess I kind of assumed it because mom was making painting all the time. She had studied under Tony Smith and Hans Hofmann, so I grew up with just abstraction. Like there were the very few figurative stuff was on the walls in the house I grew up in. So a lot of abstraction. If anything, like Helen Frankenthaler was a name that I knew of as a kid, and certainly Hans Hofmann was talked about in the home. And then, I guess around I guess around 1978, so I would have been 10. They figured out, oh my God, this kid's dyslexic. I couldn't read, I couldn't tell time. I was basically kind of like a bump on a log in a classroom. I just didn't know what to do. And if any of your listeners are dyslexic, they'll understand like what that's about. I saw letters literally jumble on this on the chalkboard, so I just didn't understand it. Ironically, music came really easily to me, so I could like I was pretty in tune with music, and that kind of opened up a couple of areas for me. One, art and music and drawing and sculpting with clay seemed to be really easy for me at a very young age. So I was in some ways quite lucky. I was put into a program in the public school that I was in with a woman named Barbara Sussman. She was my teacher, and she was amazing. I mean, I rode the short bus for 3 years. It was actually kind of miserable, to be honest with you. That said, Barbara was interesting, and she applied for a grant from the Guggenheim Foundation at a very early time when the Guggenheim Foundation was trying out a new program called Learning to Read Through the Arts. And you have to understand, like back then in the 70s, like to be dyslexic or learning disabled or ADHD, all that stuff, like we didn't have this language back then. So they were like, whatever, just pass the kid along. And a lot of people who I knew, including my oldest brother, kind of got moved up through the grades with no real addressing the learning disabilities that these people were dealing with. Barbara was quite ingenious, and she brought in an artist through the Guggenheim, and we built a dark room in the classroom. We learned how to photograph, old school with film. We learned how to develop the photographs and develop the film, print our own photos, and then hand color them, all under the auspices of essentially teaching, these kids how to read and build a linear narrative. And I have to tell you that inclination toward narrative still stays with me all these years later. So I guess the question that you're asking is like, when did I decide to be an artist or even think that that was a possibility? It was definitely then, and it wasn't really even in the classroom, Christopher. It was on an inexplicable field trip. They dragged all of this motley crew of like learning disabled kids, and it was quite a crew, into the Guggenheim Museum one day. I grew up in New Jersey, so it was 35 miles away. And we walked in, and I was confronted with the retrospective of Joseph Beuys. And so this was 78, probably, I guess it was the spring. And it was so weird. I'd never seen art like this. And Joseph Beuys, if you can imagine walking into the Guggenheim and being presented on the first floor in the lobby, giant blocks of lard that were taller than and they're just massive. And so the sense of scale and weird material, the inclination that there was a story behind all these materials, that materials had meaning, and it wasn't anything familiar to me. So I had lots of questions. I saw a piano was covered in felt and a grandfather clock covered in felt. I didn't know why. I wanted to understand why. So I found his work really provocative, and I was just 10. What did I know? And as we walked up the spiral through like just weird installation after weird installation, I had this sense that like, oh, this is art. You could make stuff like this. I want to do that. So I had an interest in kind of, I don't know, he really inspired me. And when we got to the very top of the spiral, all of the kids in my class and I were totally delighted to see all of our photographs on the wall. So, like, my first show was at the Guggenheim Museum. Can you imagine?
I imagine every day.
Yeah, it's pretty fabulous.
That's such a great story.
Well, I kind of it really became a turning point for me. And although, later on I thought I would join the Navy and become a welder because that seemed practical. We didn't have a lot growing up. So like being practical was important to me. But at the end of the day, a friend of mine suggested that I go study welding at art school because I could go learn how to weld at an art school. And I thought, oh, and that's essentially that made sense to me. And that experience at the Guggenheim kind of sealed the deal really early on.
Yeah,
Mhm.
wonderful. Um, Another question about realization. So,
Mhm.
when did you understand or begin to understand your sexual orientation, and what was your coming out
Mhm.
process like?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a weird one. I was pretty young actually. It's always interesting to me to hear some other people, gay men and lesbians, talk about the notion of coming out in their 20s, and I'm like, really? I knew when I was 5. I was really I didn't have the language for it.
Right.
But I definitely knew that I was not like my siblings or the other kids, in the sense that well, I had certain attractions and fantasies, as any child would. We're all kind of sexual beings, and I think at the time I was 5. I remember getting in the back of the VW Bug that my parents had. I sat in the middle, of course, because I was the youngest, in the back seat between my two older brothers, who were totally obnoxious. And I loved them, but they were just brutal as kids. And my sister sat in the front, and my dad sat in the driver's seat. And my mom was like, I'm not going to church this Sunday, because she usually didn't want to go. And my dad was pretty Catholic, and still is, and pretty religious. So it was a big deal to go to church. And I'm sitting there in the back because it was summertime. I remember being dressed in my little suit and not feeling particularly comfortable. And I just verbalized this fantasy that I had about this nursery school teacher who I thought was really hot. And talked about naked men, like a little 5-year-old will just say anything. And my sister turned and looked at me with this look on her face of just utter embarrassment and horror for me. And she said, "Did you hear what he just said?" And both my brothers at that moment like punched me really hard in either arm. And my dad just looked in the mirror, and I could see his face, and he just said, "Yes." Oh my God, it could have, you know, just spit nails. And and I realized at that moment, Christopher, that this was not a safe place for me to be myself. And I suspect that other people who are gay, or queer, will understand that realization. And it's that moment where I started to adapt and change the way that I behaved. I suddenly became very conscious of how I held myself. I don't want to have a limp wrist. I don't want to look at my nails that way. And again, all of this at 5, 6, 7 years old. I don't want to sound too gay, all that stuff. Um, and so at a really early age, 5, I definitely knew I was gay, although I didn't have that language. And I also, at the same moment, realized that the world was not going to be there to support me. Um, and that was certainly evident from the pulpit of the churches. Like I said, I went to a lot of church, 6, 7 days a week. It was a big deal in my
Oh,
family.
wow.
What's funny though, when I think about it, I'm the one who actually went to the most church, because I was in the choir. So, she was always singing. And my siblings were like acolytes and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I'm the one who actually probably went to more church than anybody. You'd think on some level, as a gay man, I might have purely negative experiences with that. And certainly I did. But no, actually, I had like incredible experiences. The choir director was this amazing gay man who taught us how to sing in German and Latin and Old English, and I learned to read music before I learned to read English. So in some ways, it was this retreat from well, a somewhat hostile home. And even though the canon, who is like the head priest at the Episcopal Church, was kind of a serious blowhard and not particularly friendly to gay people, I did find little moments of inspiration in that. Anyways, I digress a little bit, but yeah, I knew I was gay when I was 5. I started to come out really in my late teenage years, although I was already going to the city at the age of 12 and 13. I mean, it might sound kind of strange today to parents to hear like a 12-year-old going to the city by themselves, but I did. I would save up my money, and we all worked in restaurants. We were pretty poor. I was on like food stamps and shit. So working at restaurants made perfect sense for all of us. My brother Chris got us jobs in one restaurant, and and it was a great way to kind of become more independent. So I found myself getting on the train for $5 and taking the train all the way into the city, getting off at Christopher Street and 9th Street, and walking down Christopher Street to the pier at like 12 and 13. And I kind of loved it. I would flirt with all the boys. I mean, I was way young. I was total jailbait, but I was really looking for my tribe. So even before I hit puberty, I kind of knew what was up. And and I was up for an adventure. And sometimes that introduced me to really fantastic, memorable moments, you know. Um, I remember sunbathing on the piers. Now, the pier back in what, in the late 70s, early 80s, the piers were collapsing into the river. I mean, it was kind of a wreck. New York City was a fucking train wreck, but it was also this magical place for me as a boy and as a early like preteen to walk down to the pier and see everybody like sunbathing nude. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then I would just, you know, take off my shirt. I wasn't quite bold to take off my pants. And I would get a suntan with them, usually just a sunburn, to be honest with you. And you know, if you've ever seen that film Paris is Burning, like those kids were down there. They were a little bit older than me, and some of them were younger than me, but like they were there dancing, listening to boom boxes, and it just seemed magical. Um, so to me, coming out and being queer was kind of a rebellious moment because I felt like I was doing something that was forbidden. Just to go down to Christopher Street was forbidden. Now I didn't really come out until later to my family, and I'll be honest with you, when I did, I was sent to conversion therapy, and that was not a great experience for me. You know, in some ways, I'm lucky that I had enough gumption and general difficulty with authority figures that my initial reaction was, I like sucking cock, fuck you, you know, and that was kind of like that was my first session in conversion therapy, and they were like, yeah, this isn't gonna work. You have to have the right attitude. And I'm like, I was not an easy patient for them. And good because they don't need it easy. Um, Anyhow, I don't know if that answers your question, but that touches on a little bit of my experiences of coming out.
I feel like it's a perfect answer to my question. Thank you for that answer to my
You're
question.
welcome, Christopher.
So, I feel like we have a pretty representative understanding of the formation of you as an artist and the formation of you as queer.
Sure.
Uh, let's bring it into the here and now and talk about your work.
Okay.
So, with all of that in mind, tell us
Hmm.
what your art is about. And even if it isn't directly evident, do you see a relationship between the art that you make and your
Yeah.
queer identity? Like, I
Yeah.
wanted you to tell your formation stories for the
Oh,
audience, but I
sure.
wanted you to tell them for you. So
Yeah.
now you've said it. Talk
Yeah.
about your art, and do you see any linkage, and what is it?
You know, I do, and I think, you know, I mean, we've known each other for a number of years, so you've seen my work kind of evolve. But I will say
I've
that
seen it
at one,
change.
you
Like
have.
when people
Yeah.
say evolve, I said kind of get pushed because it
Yeah,
has
yeah,
this
yeah.
thing of like improvement. Like
Yeah.
I loved your work back then, and I
You're
loved your work
fine.
now.
Thank
Like
you.
I'm
It's
gonna
very sweet of
let's
you.
just say it's changed.
It has. And I'll be honest with you, that's a big part of what my work is about. I think that's a hard thing for artists in general. You're not supposed to change. You're supposed to have a style and stick with it and make it marketable and all that stuff that the art world and the market and the collectors and curators feel more comfortable with. But the reality is my work has always been shifting and changing. However, your question kind of gets to like, all right, well, what's the meaning behind all this stuff? And I would say 30 years ago when I was in grad school, I would not have been able to answer that. Grad school was in some ways a thing that shook me up, in the sense that I came in really focused on ceramic and sculpture, and I pivoted in grad school to painting, something that I've been very reluctant to do. Painting seemed like capital P art, you know, like really, really like it's important. And I was doing like lowly craft work at a time when ceramics was not cool. And in any case, you know, when I shifted to painting and started to do these assemblages that combined ceramic and painting and image and object, in some ways that created the seeds for what I do today. Um, at the time, I was doing these pieces that, when I step back and look at them in retrospect, they almost seemed like little altar pieces. And in fact, they kind of are. They act like an altar. They're often mounted on a wall. They often have little objects like Roman household gods, you know, something like that. And there's usually an image, often kind of a graven image. Sorry, I grew up in a lot of church, so graven images forbidden.
Look it
And
up, kids.
yeah, basically saint worship became a big part of my upbringing, and in a way, it kind of influenced my work. So, my earlier work where I was doing personas and creating characters that are loosely based on historical figures and kind of revising them into these queer characters, radical, rebellious characters, and then making work about them and for them. So that's kind of older work, meaning like 20 years ago, 15 years ago. But today that work, frankly, still is in my mind, but a lot of what my work about is it's really about the notion of erasure. So if you think about that queer experience of being met with hostility as soon as you just hint at the idea that like this is my authentic self, and your family and your church and your school and all the institutions, your government says no, you learn how to code switch, as the kids say, or pivot, or camouflage, walk differently, speak differently. And so that notion of hiding oneself definitely influences a lot of what I'm doing in the studio, and it often manifests as notions of layering. So I might begin these days with a portrait, or an image of a place or a thing. And then through layering, I'm going to layer over images with these prints that I'm kind of transferring onto the surface. I'm often layering and then scraping away, so you see little fragments of an image. But in essence, the image itself, the underlying image, the person, the identity, the thing, essentially gets camouflaged or to some degree disappears. And pentimento is this notion of the image emerging through all of this erasure and layering. So a lot of my work formally is simply about layering, and kind of obfuscation. Uh, and emotionally, it's about kind of finding my voice, and finding a voice, finding your voice, and creating a space where that can exist. Um, a friend of mine who I talked to and I've trusted for many, many years, her name is Juana Valdez. She's a great sculptor. And she and I were talking. She's an Afro-Cuban woman who makes work about that lived experience. And she and I were talking, and I said, Juana, what's your work really all about? I mean, I know it's about being a Black woman, being an immigrant, being all these things, but how would you describe what you're doing? And she goes, I'm going to tell you a secret. I'm really interested in beauty. And I was like, really? Now, beauty is like when I was in grad school, not cool. You weren't allowed to say beauty. It was not okay. And I totally resonated with what she was saying, because what came out of that conversation was beauty and the sublime is a way in. It's like being the jester. To be able to get into the court, you got to tell jokes and perform a little bit. And beauty is that kind of way in, that art has this magical hold on us. And in there, I can embed all the stories that might not be welcome, or maybe won't be popular, or won't be the norm. And in there, that beauty can shine and kind of breathe life into, well, my own lived experiences, our lived experiences as queer people. And I think in a strange way, beauty is the common ground that we all meet at, wherever we're coming from. Uh, so I don't know, that might be a little too poetic, but it is what it is. I'm making work that's layered, let's put it that way.
I think it was a very helpful form of poetry. Um, so artist,
Sure.
art,
Yeah.
viewer.
Yeah.
What do you hope that viewers might take away from looking at your work?
Yeah.
Do you think about that at all?
I do. I do. It's interesting because when I was in grad school, I was told not to think about it, just do the work. And I'll be honest with you, I do think about it. Partly because these days I'm teaching, so I think about that in the context of the classroom and what my students are wrestling with as well. And it comes up often in critiques, these little artificial bubbles that happen in art school. I think that at first I'm really interested in a beautiful, sublime experience. Do you have an aesthetic experience with it? Whether it's an ugly thing or a vulgar thing or a strange thing, is there an aesthetic experience? So I think of someone like, let's say, oh gosh, well, all right, I think of, let's say, somebody like Mapplethorpe, artist who couldn't be more different from me, but he's definitely attuned to beauty.
Mhm.
And if you look at his flower photographs and also the X portfolio, two bodies of work that were made at the same time, showed at the same time in the same city, but in different galleries. One was Upper East Side, the flowers. One was downtown with Holly Solomon, and that was the X portfolio. And it was quite clever. He's dealing with the same visual formal elements,
True.
all about aesthetics, but one was like dick in your face, and the other one was a lily, so I'm fascinated by that.
Right.
And I want the viewer to have a visual experience that's sublime. At the same time, I also want them to be able to find some place to be able to identify, dare I say, empathy. Seems like a bad word these days. We're run by fascists lately, so what can you say? um, to find empathy for the lived experience of someone that's not you, you know, to allow us to get into the mind and the eyes of something else. Weirdly, Christopher, I have that experience when I look at a Caravaggio or a Pontormo or a Donatello. These are like really high Renaissance, pieces, but there's something kind of peculiar, strange, and queer. I often use the term queer and peculiar in the same breath because queer might be a community and an identity and maybe even a slander, but peculiar is too. And in a strange way, peculiar makes room for all of us, not just gay people or LGBTQ people, but all of us have the opportunity to like look at the world askance and see it for what it really is, not the way that what we think it should be.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Um, so now that we understand where it is you're coming from,
Huh?
here's a fourth artboard.
Okay.
This is Pentimento 21. It was made in 2021.
Hmm.
Um, why don't you now give us a good, hard, deep dive, like 5 or 6 minutes, but instead of talking about materials and that kind of thing,
Sure.
like talk about you, talk about what it's about, talk
Yeah.
about why you needed to make it.
Sure.
Like
Sure.
take us behind the veil.
Okay. Well, let's look at the year first. 2021. I was
Sure.
making this essentially alone in my studio during the pandemic in New York City. It was kind of a bleak year, and the year before was even more so. And in some ways, I I started I'd been doing these prints on paper and then on ceramic and tin. So I was just beginning to explore printing on other materials besides paper or canvas. And I started to crumple them up. And for whatever reason, I was looking at two wildly different things. I was looking at John Chamberlain's sculpture. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically crushed metal, often car parts and stuff. Really kind of interesting textures, and they have a real hold on you in the gallery. There's some beautiful ones up at Dia Beacon. And at the same time, I was also reading uh, a series of books. I was reading the Iliad, a little light reading during the pandemic, go figure. And as I was reading the Iliad and thinking about these myths, I came across another book called The Song of Achilles, which was a book written in, gosh, 2011. And it was really an examination of the homosexual or homoerotic relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. So Patroclus is what this piece is about. If you're familiar with the story of Troy, and Achilles essentially was leading this battle against the Trojans or pardon me, against Troy, and he kind of got, I guess, depressed. Things weren't going well, and so he decided he wasn't going to go out and fight, and he stayed in the tent. And Patroclus, who was in this book presented as his lover as well as his companion, took his armor. Now, Patroclus was not a particularly good warrior. He was, I don't know, just like the lover, really. And he took Achilles' armor, put it on, pretending to be him, and then led the troops back to fight against Hector and Troy. And in the story, Patroclus is killed by Hector, and is and when Achilles finds this out, he's heartbroken and mourns the body of Patroclus as if a husband was mourning his wife. And and that's kind of presented in the original story. And in this story, The Song of Achilles, the author um, essentially points to that as a way of re-examining that story and essentially filling in this erasure that many scholars think of gay people in the history, which happens far too often, filling it in with a gay story and elaborating it and expanding upon it and bringing these characters to life. So I did this piece partly as a result of reading these two texts and thinking about history and story and mythology and our stories as people, and wondering what might it look like if instead of just accepting history and its erasures and obfuscations of gay stories or queer people, what if we inserted them back in? What if we looked at the gaps in our stories and then told new ones? So in a way, this piece was a real epiphany for me because I think I was thinking about erasure in the context of my own experience with conversion therapy and frankly just growing up gay in the United States of America, um, particularly in the 80s at the height of the AIDS crisis and under Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. To be gay was like anathema. It was not okay. And a lot of my work kind of came out of, I don't want to say trauma, that sounds too heavy, but like opposition. It was rough. There was a fight. It was political to be gay. Still is. And this book opened up a different way to think about the notion of erasure, and instead turned me on to the work of a scholar named Saidiya Hartman. Dr. Saidiya Hartman coined this phrase called critical fabulation, and you can see where this might be going if you heard the titles of my earlier work. Fabulation is a term that is used to diagnose memory loss and a person's essentially creating a fake memory and inserting into this like memory gap. And she uses it to look at the gaps and holes in our history where African American people in the African diaspora, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic slave trade, where their stories essentially were um, inventory numbers in a ship's log or a court case. That these human beings were essentially just chattel, and she looked at that and said, "I'm going to bring these characters, these people, these human beings back to life." So she started to write essentially the lives of two enslaved women in particular who were murdered by a ship's captain. And the only reason why she knew about it is because they were literally inventory on a ship's manifesto. And it was a court case where the owner, who was waiting for these two enslaved women, uh, felt that the ship's captain did not live up to the contract. It was literally contract law. No humanity. It was bloodless, the way that so much of our history is. Pretty ugly history, frankly. And she managed to bring these two women to life, telling the story of their life together, how they supported each other amidst all this horror. Reading that work and understanding Saidiya Hartman's research opened up a whole different way of thinking about the notion of erasure for me as a gay man. And although I'm dealing with a different context and a different lived experience, the idea of fabulation to do revisionist histories kind of led to the term confabulation, to with fabulation. And then fantabulosas, which often comes up in my work, is kind of a term that comes out of the gay coded language, often called polari, which is kind of an English slang. Um, any case, there's a lot of layers to my work. And if we go back to just the formal kind of presentation of this piece was really about Patroclus and Achilles, and it was about the mourning of Patroclus by Achilles. Hence, there's this veil with an image printed on it, and then mounted to tin. So it's actually a rigid thing that covers the face. The face itself is a bust made out of clay and covered in a tin glaze, a very ancient glaze that was invented in Persia about 2,000 years ago. It has this little touch of pink to it, which I kind of love. So at the end of the day, I'm interested in the stories and the erasures and the ways that we might fill in those gaps. But I'm also interested in, I mean, it's funny. I don't want to trap myself into it, but I am interested in classicism, which is, I know, very uncool. But I love all that stuff. I think it's fascinating. And in some ways, this piece really opened up a whole different way of thinking about how I was making, how gay, queer experiences and histories also influence my work, why they're important to me, or all of us, frankly, and how I might explore that idea, represent that idea through materials.
That is so wonderful. And I love it that, or what I find fascinating is if I was standing and looking at that, I would probably take away something.
Mm,
What I would take away is like, I mean, what you've just shared is so like robust. And
mm.
I appreciate you sharing it. I appreciate being able to listen to it.
Thanks,
Um,
Christopher. I think, I do want to say, to your listeners that like I really I want you to have a visual experience with the work. Whether you kind of get all those references, that's okay. Those really for me to be able to wrestle with in the studio, so that I can find meaning in what I'm making. Otherwise, it's just me making a bunch of objects and it feels kind of, bloodless. And I don't want my work to be bloodless, at least in my own mind. My hope is maybe some of that comes through in the most abstract way. But I hear you. I hear you.
yeah, I could definitely stand in front of it and get something that was helpful and additive. It's just
Mm.
once you just like amplify it with that big story and all the conceptual things around him, and it's just like, oh, like I might I might not think about this work for the rest
Mm.
of the day, but I'll
Hmm.
think about what you said for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
So as exciting as the work is to me and you are to me, like there's this whole sort of like
Mm.
thing to chew on and consider, like the ideas, like
Yeah.
that's just wonderful.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Um, so next question. Uh, when you or people hear the word queer,
Mm.
probably signifies like we have all the things that we wrap around that word. When
Mm.
people hear the word art,
Mm.
separate things that people wrap around the word.
Yeah.
When I say to you the word queer art, when I join those two things together,
Yeah.
like what does that joinder mean to you?
Mm. Well, I guess first I want to kind of begin with the word separately, if that's okay.
Please do.
So queer for me early on was a slander. It was an insult. I remember maybe I was 7 or 8. I was walking down the street in front of my elementary school, and this car drove by with a bunch of teenagers in it, and they saw me. I didn't even know who they were, and all I heard was "faggot," and then it drives away. Any gay person who's experienced that will understand what that feels like. I didn't even know what the word meant, but I knew it was directed at me, and I knew something was up with me, that they saw something,
Sure.
and so to be queer, to have that word laid at your feet, uh, to be called a faggot to your face, I can't even tell you how many times that's happened to me. Um, stings. It doesn't feel good at all. And when I started to come out, when I was a teenager, maybe even a little later than that, like maybe 18, 19, 20, it was the height of the AIDS epidemic. I remember walking in, not just down to the piers to get a suntan, but I walked into the gay and lesbian community center back then, I guess it was 87 or 88, probably 87, something like that. And I walked in and I was just looking for, I don't know, I was looking to wink at some boys and, I don't know, have some, I don't know what I was looking for,
We
Christopher.
know what you were looking for.
Not much good, and I was just looking for boys. And of course I was told jailbait, so nobody fucking came near me. But I walked into the center. The center back then was like not renovated. It was kind of a dilapidated old thing. They still had a coal furnace of all things back then, and everything was covered in graffiti. There was like I think I mean, there were famous painters who had painted on the walls. I think the Keith Haring piece was already up at that
Yeah.
point in the bathroom. And I walked into the big open hall because there seemed to be a lot of activity there. It was in the evening. And I walked into one of the early ACT UP meetings, and there was Larry Kramer screaming at everybody to shut up. And some woman stood up and said, announced to the room, all members of law enforcement need to identify themselves right now. And I'm like, what is this? I was 17, maybe 18. And I encountered people who were angry and political, and they were talking about doing an action. I didn't even know what that meant. I just knew like they were going to do something, and I knew it was about AIDS. I knew that people were talking about um and they had an urgency in their voice. Everything was important, and that they were all working together to make that happen. That was profound to me, and it made me kind of look at what it was to be queer, what it was to be gay. And it was actually about power, about being strong, about working as a community together. Lesbians and gay people and trans people all like armed together. And I'd never really, I grew up with the image of like that the faggot as some sense of humor, the clown or the tragic suicide at the end of every, gay story, because we all were either evil or pathetic. And here was a group of people who were like, fuck you. And I was all for that. I thought that was great. And so how does this relate to the word queer? Well, at the same time the ACT UP was happening, Queer Nation started to happen. It was a younger group. They were a little bit more aggressive in some ways, if you can imagine somebody more aggressive than ACT UP. And they had, in some ways, a much bigger idea about coming out and what gay rights was about. And I remember marching with the Queer Nation group in the Pride March that next year. And so for me, queer is about power and action and community and strength. And then, if I pivot to art, it might sound perhaps sentimental or naive, but for me, art is so much about magic. Art has been magical for me from the get-go. And I love the idea of being able to string together a bunch of materials and tell a story. Um, I think so to some degree, queer art is so much about community and strength and power, maybe even uh, politics, but not so much. The dogma doesn't really, it almost gets in the way. Power and magic, in essence, a powerful magic. How about that?
How about that? Thank you.
You're welcome.
We've reached sort of the end of our time, and I think what is powerfully evident to me is that people are going to want to see more work and hopefully like understand and listen to more stories and
Yeah,
thoughts and ideas about what the work is about,
sure.
and probably talk to you.
Okay.
So can you please let us know how it is we see your work,
Hmm.
how it is we understand the ideas behind your work,
Hmm.
and if appropriate, how do we talk to you?
Sure, sure. Well, I do keep a website. It's andrewcornellrobinson.com. And I usually put my newer work up. And I do also provide some writing and essays and things often related to my teaching, but also about the work and research I'm doing. You can find me on Instagram, which, I know can be a little bit much, but you can find me at ACR Studio. That's my handle on Instagram. There's some other ones too, but that's the main one. And then this year I've been really blessed. I was asked to build a site-specific sculpture at Socrates Sculpture Park in Queens, which if you've never been there is amazing. Come join us. I'll be there most of the summer building a sculpture, and it should be live and up and open to the public in October. So come visit. And then in November, the New York State Council on the Arts gave me a grant to develop a new body of work called Confabulations and Fantabulosas, which, you've heard this name already. And that will be a series of 12 new pieces that I'm going to show in November into December at the Equity Gallery, which is on the Lower East Side in New York City. Come to Equity. I'll be there at the opening and we can talk.
This is all wonderful.
Okay.
Again, I just want to say I appreciate you so much.
Likewise, Christopher.
For all of this, to listen to this, and for being our debut episode. Thank you.
We appreciate you taking the time to join us for this episode of Queer Art Podcast. Our social and web links are listed here on screen. If you'd like to support us, please share this episode with the art lovers in your life. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.